It starts with one question. What if two monsters each feared in their own right aren't just real, but locked in a war we were never meant to witness? Night vision crackles, a blurred silhouette crashes between trees, something else follows, it faster, heavier, then it stops, complete silence. You can hear the wind hold its breath, quick cuts, real locations, real coordinates, flash. Huron-Manistee, National Forest, a gutted deer, untouched by scavengers, footprints that shift from quadruped to biped mid, two different howls, one right after the other, and then a voice. Whispered, cracked. I saw them both, and they saw me, the screen glitches. You're about to see evidence that's never aired publicly. You're about to hear the theory that explains why people disappear after reporting both creatures in the same place. And you're going to ask yourself something no one wants to ask: what happens when one of them wins? But don't blink, because the real reveal doesn't come until the final section where we piece together the last footage, the final theory, and what might be coming next. This isn't just a story about monsters. This is the story of the last monster left standing. The wilderness doesn't whisper, it watches. Long before you hear the snap of a branch or the distant rumble of padded feet, you feel that ancient chill that rolls down your spine, like it remembers something your mind has forgotten. This isn't fear from storybooks. This is the dread that lives in marrow. Passed down from ancestors who knew better than to walk alone under a moonlit canopy. Something is out there, and it's not alone. Most of us never notice the signs. A deer trail that suddenly ends in claw-marked mud. A silence to complete, where even the insects seem to hold their breath. A strange smear on bark that looks too high to reach. We tell ourselves it's nothing. We go back to our lives. Lights, cities, concrete. But the forest never stopped watching, and neither did the things that rule it when we're not looking. Over centuries, two names have echoed from the mouths of the frightened, scribbled into the journals of the obsessed, and carried in low, urgent tones from campfire to campfire. Werewolf, Dogman, monsters, myths, mistakes. But what if they weren't myths at all? What if these weren't just two different names for the same nightmare, but two entirely different predators, each with their own law, their own territory, their own hunger? And what if that hunger has never been for us, but for each other? In the northern pines of Michigan, there are reports of a shadow taller than a bear, faster than a man, with burning eyes and a snarl that vibrates through the bones of your chest. It walks upright, it watches cabins from the tree line, and then it disappears. Locals call it the Dogman, and they swear it's real. Hundreds of miles away in the dense Appalachian hollows, others speak of a beast that transforms under the moon. A man one moment, a creature the next. Shaggy fur, elongated limbs, eyes full of sorrow and fury. Not just a monster, but a cursed soul. The werewolf. The world wants them to be the same. Easier to dismiss that way, but they're not. They move differently. They kill differently. They leave different marks, and more importantly, they leave no room for the other. This isn't just about cryptids or legends. This is about territory, dominance, apex power. Because nature doesn't tolerate two kings. Every shred of footage, every half-blurred trail cam capture, every low-frequency howl recorded on some forgotten widget all hints at something deeper. Not a singular myth, but a clash. An ancient rivalry fought just beyond the reach of our lights. And now, finally, the pieces begin to align. Reports once thought to be isolated suddenly overlap. Sightings of dogmen and werewolves within miles of each other, conflicting claw marks, tracks crisscrossed like a battlefield, disappearances, torn animals left untouched by scavengers, silence where there should be sound. If these creatures exist, then so does the war between them. Tonight, we step into that silence. Into the places cameras don't stay on for long. We follow the threads, buried in fear, folklore, and fragments of reality. We hunt the hunters, and in doing so, we risk something greater than fear. We risk seeing the truth, because this isn't about proving one exists, it's about what happens when both do. This is Werewolf versus Dogman. Not fiction, not fantasy, the unseen war for the top of the food chain. Before you can understand what hunts the forest, you have to understand what birthed it. The werewolf myth is not one myth. It is many, fractured, transformed, like the creature itself, It has changed across time, cultures, and continents, but always, there is one constant: a man, a curse, a beast, in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Dated back to ancient Mesopotamia. The hero rejects a lover for fear she will transform him as she did her previous mate into a wolf. The Greeks told of Lycaon, cursed by Zeus for serving human flesh and turned into a beast for his sins. The Norse had the Lfhnar, wolf-coated berserkers who fought with a frenzy that could not be called human. And in medieval Europe, tales of the werewolf exploded during times of plague and panic, when fear walked hand in hand with the unknown. The modern werewolf, the one stamped into cinema with silver bullets and blood moons, was shaped by ink and celluloid. But it came from somewhere real, somewhere primal. The idea that inside every man, there is something monstrous, waiting to be unleashed, a punishment, a possession, a transformation. The werewolf is not just a creature of the night, it is a mirror, a reflection of the violence buried beneath the skin. But what of the other? The Dogman has no silver screen fame, no operatic transformation under moonlight. It does not emerge from Gothic mansions or haunted castles. It crawls out of the American wild like something too old to be named. In 1887, a man in Wexford County, Michigan, claimed to have seen a beast standing over 7 feet tall, covered in dark fur, with the head of a dog and the eyes of a man. The story spread. It echoed again in 1938. In Paris, Michigan, again in 1961, then in 1987. It exploded. A radio DJ played a novelty song called The Legend. Recounting a Dogman encounter, listeners began to call in, dozens, then hundreds, with their own stories. Unlike the werewolf, the Dogman is not a curse, it is a constant. It does not change, it does not feel guilt, it is not part man, but something wholly other. An apex predator with intelligence behind its eyes and rage in its throat. Witnesses say it doesn't flee when spotted, it stares, it studies, it chooses when to vanish. Where werewolves are seen during full moons, the Dogman has no cycle. It appears during storms, power outages, hunting seasons. It walks roads at twilight. It hovers just past your headlights. The Dogman is a hunter that knows it's being watched, and doesn't care. Some believe it's an ancient spirit, others say it's a biological cryptid, a cousin to Bigfoot, or some relic from prehistory. But in recent decades, a new theory has taken shape. That Dogmen are territorial, that they don't simply appear at random. They patrol, they claim, they warn, and when their territory is challenged, they respond, and that's where the real divide begins. For centuries, werewolves were viewed as the cursed children of man, damned to transform under the moon, driven to kill, then waking with bloodied hands and no memory. The Dogman, however, has no such arc. It doesn't change, it doesn't suffer, it doesn't regret. In this way, the Dogman is not a horror of transformation, it is a horror of permanence. And yet, both creatures occupy similar realms: dense forest, isolated roads, rural outskirts, always near civilization but never in it, always near humans but never too close. Some cryptid researchers suggest this overlap in behavior is not accidental, it's conflict. To predators drawn to the same environments, yet too dominant to share them, one born from human myth, one possibly older than the myth itself. If the werewolf is the embodiment of man's inner beast, the Dogman is the rejection of man altogether, a creature that never was us, that never wanted to be, that looks back at our world with cold contempt and ancient instinct. Some say that's why they fight, because there cannot be two shadows over one domain. Not when both believe they are the top of the chain. So as we peel back the stories, the myths and the fears, what begins to emerge is something more terrifying than either creature alone. A rivalry, a blood feud, an apex war hidden in the folds of our oldest fears, and we haven't even stepped onto the battlefield yet. The map comes alive when you lay the sightings side by side. Pins in the Upper Peninsula, red threads through the Huron Forest. A cluster along the Blue Ridge, a stubborn knot in the Olympic foothills. Lines begin to form when none should exist. They follow rivers, ridgelines, power corridors, and abandoned logging roads. They swerve around towns and cut straight through the forgotten spaces between them. The pattern does not shout, it hums. Locals talk about bad nights when even the crickets fold into silence. Farmers lock barns early. Hikers pretend they misheard the heavy pacing past the tree line. Wardens ride up coyotes to calm a page, then drive home with knuckles pale on the wheel. In those nights, the battleground feels close. Fences lean, branches hang low and clod. Wind carries a copper tang that does not belong to leaves or rain. The evidence begins with tracks, because evidence always begins where weight meets ground. Paw impressions too large for a wolf. Sunk deep, like a sandbag met the soil. 5 toes appear in one set, 4 in another. Claw tips carve crescents at the edge of the pad. Then the stride stutters. Impressions lengthen and narrow. Digitigrade becomes something else. A long heel where no heel should be. The line of travel rises out of quadruped rhythm and settles into a 2-beat march. No human prints follow, no boot, no tread. Only that strange non-human biped pace that leaves investigators in a slow cold sweat. Tree sign tells a second story. Scratches scallop the bark 8 feet up, sometimes higher, as if something reached and raked to mark rank. Sap bleeds thick and sweet and clings to coarse hairs matted into the wound. Some strands test as canine under cheap at-home kits, then reject standard markers in a lab. Under a microscope, the cuticle looks wrong, the medulla too dense, as if the hair came from an animal that forgot to consult modern taxonomy before shedding. Kill sites add a third chapter. Deer torn open with a violence that reads like intent rather than hunger. Organs removed with a speed that suggests habit. Bones splintered where bears tend to crack and chew. Carcasses sometimes left in the open, as if to warn, sometimes dragged and half buried like a claim. Livestock pens show bolts twisted out rather than chewed. The ground around them records circling paths, wide and deliberate, the way apex predators size each other up. Crows gather and do not land. At night, the forest speaks. Recorders catch layered calls that do not map cleanly to wolf, coyote, cougar, or man. A long rising howl with an almost choral resonance. A second voice interrupts with a lower rasp, throatier, and edged in static. Spectrograms show overlapping. Bands and odd harmonics. Wildlife techs shake their heads. Folklorists take notes. Cryptid trackers play the clips in garages lit by single bulbs and stare at the floor. Not because they understand the sound, but because something in the tone unsettles the part of the mind that still remembers firelight and stone. Drones help. Until they do not, thermal cameras sweep the dark and paint the world in heat. Elk glow, rabbits spark and vanish. Then a mass appears between trunks, too tall to narrow through the waist. Radiating like a furnace, it moves with a studded grace. No panic, no deer startle. Eyes reflect with a steady, unblinking countergaze. The feed crushes into static the moment it approaches the canopy and returns when the shape is gone. The pilot blames interference and packs up early. Gate cams and trail cams tell their own quiet truths. A right edge blur at 43 inches off the ground. A left panel shadow where no tree stands. A single frame where a muzzle, narrow and long, clips the corner as if testing the lens. Sometimes a full silhouette strides by, but always during storms, fog banks, or the flash of lightning that blows out the exposure. Batteries drain faster than expected. Time stomps, skip minutes. The models are not cheap. The stories are not new. The human layer adds friction to the data. A cryptozoologist connects the threads and proposes overlap zones where 2 species would contest a corridor. A wildlife biologist counters that misidentification and fear are engines powerful enough to drive legends across generations. A folklorist maps the telling and retelling of the same archetype as cultures shift and landscapes change. Then admits that place names centered on wolves and devils tend to overlap with the modern reports. All 3 agree on one point only. People believe for a reason. Some reasons feel physical, magnetic anomalies along certain ridges, fry compasses, and scramble phones. Old mines vent cold air laced with metallic breath. Weather systems slide off high country and hang a low ceiling over clear cuts and river bends where sound behaves strangely. The terrain itself conspires to distort sense. And in distortion, something else steps forward. Not illusion exactly, invitation, fieldcraft evolves to meet the problem. Teams set scent posts with gland lures taken from canids, only to find the bait stations skirted with deliberate arcs that keep wind in the intruder's favor. Call blasters, howl at midnight and receive responses that triangulate from 3 positions, although trackers counted only 2 sets of prints at dawn. Casts are taken, soil cores are bagged, every sample carries the note that nothing conclusive has been captured, and everything points away from lab certainty. Yet the pattern of behavior grows sharper with each attempt. What emerges is a portrait of a contested landscape, rather than a chain of isolated scares. A ridge in Tennessee, where livestock vanish every 3rd full moon for 6 cycles in a row. Interrupted only when a second set of prints appears and a dead buck is left untouched on the fence line. A logging road in Washington where a pair of howl signatures alternate over 5 nights. Recorded from the same 2 clearings half a mile apart. A Wisconsin farm where something paces a barn on 2 legs. Followed a week later by shredded cedars across the property boundary near a swampy slough. Separate events form a rhythm. The rhythm suggests intent. The battleground is not a single place, it is any threshold where wild ground meets the edge of human order. It is the forgotten spur behind a subdivision, the second growth valley between 2 peaks. The long swale behind a derelict mill, it shifts as prey shifts and as seasons turn, it moves with fire, flood, and logging schedules. It breathes like an organism that knows the shape of its lungs. Step back from the pins and threads and the hummed. If 2 apex forces move through these corridors, their paths collide in pulses. When they do, the forest stills. Marks multiply, voices layer, carcasses lie untouched beneath watcher trees. Afterward, everything resumes as if nothing happened, except for the people who heard, saw, or simply felt that cold pressure in the dark, and now keep porch lights on a little longer than they used to. The battleground is not chosen, it is claimed. And something out there keeps the ledger. It begins with blood in the grass and ends with silence in the trees. There is no warning, no roar of dominance, no thunder of approach, just the aftermath. Violent, precise, unnatural, something that died, fighting something else just as brutal. No scavenger touches the remains, not coyotes, not bears, not birds. Something about the kill smells wrong. Older than death, marked, this isn't hunting, this is war. Every species has its predators, but apex predators, true apexes don't hunt each other. Not unless they're forced, not unless they are driven by something older than territory. Or hunger, something hardwired into sinew and instinct, a refusal to share the crown. Werewolf and Dogman, beast and brute. One cursed with transformation and cunning, the other born monstrous, without mercy, without a past. The forests aren't big enough for both. The hills aren't quiet enough. The wilderness does not forgive rivalry. Cryptid theorists argue over the nature of their conflict. But the patterns are too violent to ignore. Reports increase in overlapping territories, the signs become layered, claw marks intersecting on trees. Footprints that circle and double back. It's not just that they appear near one another. It's that something happens when they do. Territory may be the trigger, but it's more than land. These creatures don't compete for space, they compete for narrative. For dominance in the story that humanity tells about what lurks just beyond the campfire. They are mythic rivals etched in fear, and when they cross, they don't retreat. The werewolf fights with fury and strategy. It's a predator, born of paradox, part man, part monster. Witnesses describe ambush tactics, unnatural, speed, the ability to flank prey or opponent with an intelligence that borders on military. It uses cover, it uses moonlight, it learns. The Dogman is different, its approach is relentless, forward, animalistic, but not stupid. It doesn't stalk, it confronts, stands upright, opens its arms like it dares you to run. Its power is in bared not in hunger, but in challenge. It rips through obstacles. It doesn't need to outsmart, it only needs to overpower. Now imagine these two meeting at the edge of a riverbank. The water low, the moon fat and full, the trees bare in winter's reach. One emerges from the north woods, silent, breath curling into the cold air. The other rises from the reeds, taller, broader, black eyes catching starlight. The air tenses. No call, no warning. Just the sudden lunge, clash, torn soil, broken branches, blood that spatters and steams against stone. The werewolf moves fast, circling, slashing. The dogman takes the hits and returns them tenfold, clawing deep, forcing space. One fights, like a cursed warrior. The other, like a born executioner. Their conflict is not just physical. It is elemental. Fire versus ash, moonlight versus shadow, both ancient, both wrong, both real. Some researchers believe these encounters have been witnessed more often than we know, but the stories don't survive intact. Eyewitnesses contradict themselves. Details shift in retellings, memories fragment. Maybe the trauma of watching two monsters tear at each other bends perception. Or maybe something darker manipulates the memory, leaves gaps where truth should be. One man in rural Pennsylvania claimed to have seen the battle from his porch. He described it in pieces. A growl that started as a bark, but ended like a scream. A blur of fur and fang. One figure hurling the other into a tree. Blood, black in the moonlight, then silence. By the time he stepped off the porch with his shotgun, the yard was empty. No bodies, just claw marks in the siding and a broken fence post driven 6 inches into the ground. He moved 2 months later. In southern Kentucky, a hunter reported hearing what he thought was a wolf fight, but the sounds didn't match any animal he knew. Deep snarls layered over each other, followed by wet cracks and the unmistakable sound of something huge running upright across fallen leaves. He returned in daylight to find a clearing ripped apart. No tracks, no scavengers, just destruction. Again and again. We find evidence of violence with no predator to pin it on, conflicting tracks, deep gashes in bark or stone, strange vocalizations, but never both creatures seen clearly at once. Only the suggestion of a conflict that ends before the human world catches up. The absence of definitive proof doesn't mean peace, it means efficiency. These are not dumb beasts blundering into each other, they are calculated, practiced, lethal. If they fight, they finish. If one falls, the victor ensures nothing remains. That, more than anything, should terrify us, because it means they don't just kill each other, they erase each other. Not for prey, not for revenge, but because the wild only has room for one god, and it is still undecided which one that is. When the battle is over, the woods do not cheer, they swallow the evidence. What's left behind is never a body, never a trophy. Just an impression in the ground where something massive once stood. A broken limb, a smear of fur against stone. An uncanny silence that stretches too long, like nature itself is holding its breath. This is the part no one talks about, because once the dust settles, the questions begin, not about what happened, but about what it means. The werewolf and the dogman are not just cryptids vying for dominance. They are competing versions of fear. Archetypes wrestling for narrative power in the minds of those who believe. One rooted in transformation and tragedy, the human heart cursed to become beast. The other in alienness and rejection of predator that never had humanity to begin with. And when those mythologies clash, it's not just in the woods. It's in the consciousness of every person who glimpses a shape in the dark and wonders what they saw. Which version of the nightmare walked past their window? Which name do they give it? This isn't about folklore anymore, it's about belief systems colliding in real time. In the aftermath of these alleged encounters, witnesses change. They become hesitant in the way they describe things, not because they're unsure of what they saw but because they know no one will believe them. Their eyes dart to corners. Their words trail off. They tell their stories with a pause before the end, like the memory is incomplete. Like stepped in and erased just enough to keep the rest of us from drawing a clear picture. One woman, a park ranger in Montana, filed a confidential report after finding what she called a battlefield. Blood in wide sprays across tree trunks, deep gouges in the bark that didn't line up with any known animal, no carcasses, no predator tracks, only deep depressions like knees and claws, as if something was thrown down hard. The report never made it to the public. But years later, in a private forum, She recounted the same story with one additional detail. She said the air smelled like metal and ozone, and that her compass spun for 3 full minutes after she entered the clearing. Phenomena like this keep piling up. Areas where electronics glitch, where wildlife goes missing for days, where strange lights are seen above the trees. Some theorize these clashes don't just affect the physical world, they warp reality around them. As if the presence of these two apex forces tears something deeper than skin. Folklorists speak of thin places where the veil between worlds wears down, sacred groves, blasted heaths, crossroads. These places have always drawn monsters. Maybe the werewolf and the dogman are more than flesh and bone. Maybe they're drawn to these liminal zones by something older than instinct, something ritual, something cosmic. If that's the case, their war isn't just territorial, it's spiritual. A balance maintained by blood, by silence, by conflict never allowed to fully resolve, because if one truly won the world, might tip too far into the kind of nightmare that can't be contained. The scariest thing isn't knowing they exist. It's knowing they might need each other to exist. The dogman without the werewolf is unchecked brutality, hunger with no conscience, predator with no balance. The werewolf without the dogman is a curse with no enemy, a blade with no edge, a beast forever hunting its own reflection. Their rivalry might not be an accident, it might be a design. A monstrous equilibrium we were never meant to witness, let alone understand. So what lies beyond? Nothing we can measure, nothing we can catalogue. Only the knowing silence of a trail that ends to clean. Of cameras that glitch at the wrong second, of howls that never match the shape of any throat we've ever studied, and the slow, creeping understanding that if these creatures have been fighting this long, then something has kept them hidden, not because we aren't looking hard enough, but because they don't want us to see the winner. Because maybe if we did, the war would no longer be theirs, it would become ours. Some stories survive, not because they're told, but because they're escaped. You won't find these accounts in documentaries or police files. You'll find them in half-finished blog posts, in drunken confessions on scratchy podcasts, in private forums buried 4 layers deep, where usernames blur and timestamps disappear. You'll find them from people who tell their stories like trying to forget them at the same time. They never start with heroism. They start with a mistake. I shouldn't have gone out that night. We thought it was just coyotes. I heard something that didn't sound right, always simple, always casual, until it isn't. There's the Forest Service contractor from Utah, who was sent to clear trail blockages after a late storm. He says he found claw marks on both sides of a narrow switchback, one set high and wide, the other more angled, more deliberate. In the clearing below, he found a shallow pit where the snow had melted faster than it should have. Inside it, something had bled. Not deer, too dark, too thick, no tracks out. He filed a report. His radio failed on the hike back. A week later, he was reassigned. There's the teenage couple from Oregon who took a late-night drive on a closed service road to find a quiet place to stay. The girl says she saw 2 figures in the ditch ahead, one on all 4s, massive and dark, and another, upright, circling it slowly. She thought it was someone walking a dog, until the upright one dropped to all 4s and lunged. No leash, no sound, just movement like gravity didn't apply. They drove away with the headlights off, too afraid to even draw attention. He refuses to talk about it. She moved 3 states away, and there's the night hunter from Appalachia who thought he saw a bear hunched over a deer carcass near a ravine. He raised his rifle, then lowered it when he realized the thing was wrong. Too long in the arm, back legs that bent the wrong way, eyes that locked with his like knew. He was about to leave when another shadow stepped into frame. Taller, more upright, this one growled, not at him. At the first thing, he watched from the trees as the 2 shapes circled each other, one silent and patient, the other snarling and twitching like it couldn't wait to pounce. Then the fight began, fast, violent, impossible to follow. Trees shook, bones cracked. The screams weren't human, but they weren't animal either. He ran, dropped the rifle, never went back for it. When asked why he didn't film it, he simply said he forgot he had a phone. said it didn't matter, said the real horror wasn't what he saw, it was what saw him. These people aren't trying to go viral, they're trying to survive their own memories. Their stories overlap in unsettling ways. They speak of the same silence before the event, the same unnatural stillness afterward. They remember details that match across state lines, smells like ozone, tracks that don't make sense, trees scarred in the same diagonal pattern. Some mention losing time, others remember the exact minute but not the hour before. Most have trouble sleeping, some stop going into the woods entirely. A few never stop returning, obsessed, hollow-eyed, trying to piece together what can't be explained. But the most disturbing detail across every account, the way they describe being watched, not just by one creature, but by both. They describe a pressure behind their eyes, a prickling on the back of the neck, a sense of standing between forces that know each other and know you're not supposed to be there, like into a war zone moments before the ambush, like between gods right before they draw their claws. There are rumors of people who got too close and never came back. Researchers who disappeared after tracking too many sightings. Cryptid hunters who found something they shouldn't have and stopped posting mid-series. One podcast host received a video clip that showed two sets of eyes staring into a camera in the woods, one glowing yellow, the other dull and red. He posted a reaction, said he'd reveal the source on the next episode. There was no next episode. People chalk it up to burnout, ghosting, internet drama. But in the circles that still whisper about the rivalry, they say the line between observing and interfering is thinner than you think. And once you've seen the war, it marks you, not as an enemy, as a witness. And witnesses don't last long, because this isn't a show. It's a purge, a quiet, perpetual purge between two entities that cannot coexist, that do not want to be studied, that do not want their final battle recorded. They fight in the margins. And if you get too close to the margin, you become part of the silence. This section of the story doesn't have a clear end. Only a trail that stops, a voice that cuts off mid-sentence, a set of coordinates with no return date. Because the last witnesses don't leave behind answers, they leave behind a question. How many more vanished before we realized they were keeping something from us, or keeping us from something worse? When all the stories have been told, when every blurred photo and shaky recording has been filed away or discarded, when the last testimony fades into static or silence, one question lingers in the shadows like a slow breath before the scream. What happens if one of them wins? The werewolf and the dogman are more than monsters, they are philosophies carved in fang and sinew. The werewolf represents transformation, a man consumed by what he becomes, cursed to remember what he once was, a beast born from guilt, shame, and the horror of one's own potential. The dogman is the antithesis, no curse, no memory of humanity, a being of total predation, ancient, unapologetic, and eternal. One is a tragedy. The other is a verdict, and they cannot both endure everything. We've seen every claw mark on every twisted tree, every scorched patch of earth where sound refuses to echo. Suggests a singular truth. This isn't random. This isn't territorial coincidence or cryptid chaos. This is a cleansing. The Earth Hour. Earth is old. Older than the stories we tell. Older than the things we believe. We've forgotten. Maybe older than even the first scream that marked the arrival of fear. In that age, before man marked the stars or carved names into stone. The war between these two beings may have already begun. It could be a cycle, a curse etched not on one man, but on nature itself, a balancing act played out through blood, generation after generation, the cursed and the curseless, the conscious beast and the empty one, both born of the same darkness, but one remembered by name and the other by dread. The sightings escalate when one gets too strong. When the dogman begins to appear in daylight, staring down pickup trucks on rural roads, or the werewolf leaves clawed warnings on cabin walls under a waxing moon, the other returns. They surface like antibodies, as if one exists to keep the other in check. But here's the question that cracks everything open. What if one of them already lost? The reason we see more of one than the other in certain regions, certain decades, certain eras, it might not be chance. It might be conquest. a shifting dominance, an ongoing purge. Every time a dogman appears in a place once known for werewolf legends, maybe it's not just a sighting, maybe it's an occupation. And every time someone claims to see a werewolf where the woods once ran silent, maybe it's not resurgence, maybe it's rebellion. A final howl before extinction. The war is quiet now, but that doesn't mean it's over. If anything, it's becoming more precise, less collateral, more surgical. We've seen reports of battles that leave no witnesses, surveillance that fails only in the moments that matter, trail cams wiped clean, drones that crash mid-flight, entire hard drives rendered useless after capturing just a frame too much. Not random, not supernatural, strategic. Because when predators fight long enough, they evolve, not just to kill each other but to hide from the world that might interfere. This brings us to the final, most terrifying possibility. What if the war isn't about dominance over the wild? What if it's about who gets to survive us? Humanity is changing, expanding, building over forests, paving over territories, turning old battlefields into suburbs and state parks. The monsters are being pushed back, or so we think. But what if they're just choosing who gets to remain? If one species is going to endure, to adapt to the cracks we've made in the natural order, it can't be both. They are too large, too hungry, too bound to their ancient codes. The world won't sustain them both in secret, and so, the war continues unseen, unheard, unending, not for power, for permission. To be the last monster standing when the lights finally go out, that's the final theory. Not that the werewolf and dogman are battling for dominance today, but that one of them is preparing for tomorrow. The dogman, cold, calculating, never shifting, may be the perfect apex for a world teetering on the edge of collapse. No duality, no remorse. A creature not of punishment but of purpose, built for the dark places we no longer watch. Evolved to survive a world we're too distracted to protect. The werewolf, burdened with memory and transformation, may be the last myth that still mourns what it becomes, a being caught between what was and what must be, a cursed guardian trying to hold the line with hands that no longer feel human. Who wins? That depends on the question you ask. If you ask who is stronger, the answer shifts with the moon. If you ask who is smarter, the answer hides in the silence. But if you ask who we deserve, the answer is waiting in the trees, eyes reflecting your own, breath steaming in the cold, claws tapping against bark, waiting for the last rival to fall. And when it does, when only one remains, it won't howl. It will step into the clearing where no camera sees, walk upright where no story survives, and claim the crown forged not in myth, but in massacre. So the next time you hear a howl at night, listen closely, not to the sound, to the absence of an answer, because that silence may be the only warning you get that the war is over and something won, and for those who hunger for more. Step deeper into the shadows with our ultimate werewolf horror playlist linked in the description below. In the world of horror, the scariest things happen when you least expect them, and trust me, you don't want to be left in the dark. Welcome to the darkness.